Go back to 1980, India and China looked basically identical. If you stood on a street corner in Mumbai and then teleported to a street corner in Beijing, you would see the exact same thing. You would see dust, you would see bicycles, millions of them, and you would see an economy completely closed off to the world. In 1980, the average Indian and the average Chinese citizen were essentially the same person economically. Actually, if you want to be technically precise, the average Indian was richer. India had more railways, it had English common law, it had a democracy. China was just recovering from the chaos of Mao. Both giants started at the exact same starting line. But then, history split in two. This is the most painful graph in modern economic history. Economists call it the Great Divergence. Starting in roughly 1978, China looked at the West, swallowed its pride, and decided to become the factory of the world. They followed the iron law of the Industrial Revolution: build roads, build ports, and sell cheap goods. India chose a different path, and today it is living with the consequences of that choice. In China today, the average person generates about $13,000 a year. In India, that number is $2,700. The average Chinese citizen is now 5 times richer than the average Indian. The gap between Beijing and New Delhi today is actually wider than the gap between America and China. So when you see the headlines on Bloomberg or CNBC screaming that India is the next China, you have to ask yourself, are they looking at the math, or are they just looking for a new story? The narrative right now is perfect. It's almost Hollywood scripted. China got old, China got expensive, and frankly, China got scary. So the world's money is packing its bags and moving next door to the other billion-person giant. Morgan Stanley calls it India's decade. The IMF calls it a bright spot in a dark world. The logic is simple. India has the people. It has the democracy. It has the West on its side. It is the next China, but better. But here's the problem. Stop listening to the speeches and actually look at the numbers. You don't find a superpower, you find a paper tiger. Today, we are going to do something the mainstream media refuses to do. We are going to conduct a forensic audit of the Indian economy. We aren't relying on Twitter threads or political rallies. We are looking at the warnings from India's own former central banker, Raghuram Rajan. We are looking at the state capacity data from Professor Devesh Kapur, and we are looking at the history books, specifically the ones that explain why nations fail. Over the next 20 minutes, I am going to prove to you that India is suffering from a hardware crisis that no amount of software can fix. We will explore the Shackled Leviathan, a state that is too weak to enforce its own rules. We will expose the service trap, the mathematical impossibility of employing 1.4 billion people in call centres. And we will audit the precocious democracy, the uncomfortable truth that voting might actually be killing India's industrial revolution. This is not a hit piece. India should be the next superpower. It has the talent, it has the hunger, but unless it fixes the machine, the Indian century is over before it began. Let's open the books. To understand why the engine is broken, we have to go back to 2014. Prime Minister Modi launched a campaign called Make in India. The logic was sound, the promise was simple. Come, make your product and services in India and sell to the world. It was supposed to be the start of the Industrial Revolution, but we are here to audit the results, not the marketing. And the results are awkward. According to data from the World Bank, since the launch of that campaign, the share of manufacturing in India's GDP hasn't gone up. It has actually gone down. It fell from around 16% to roughly 13 to 15%. Think about the irony of that. The government spent a decade screaming, "We are the new China," offering billions in subsidies, and the factory sector actually shrank relative to the rest of the economy. Imagine you hire a contractor to build a skyscraper. He puts up a massive sign, he buys a fancy crane, and he talks to the press for 10 years. But when you visit the site, he has only built the reception desk. That is the Indian economy right now. They built a world-class IT sector, the reception desk. They answer your emails, they write your code, but you cannot employ 1.4 billion people at a reception desk. You need to build the rest of the building. You need the hardware. So why aren't the factories coming? It's not because Indians can't build things. It's because moving things in India is a financial nightmare. We call this the invisible tax. In China or the West, logistics costs of moving a box from A to B are usually around 8% of GDP. In India, that number is 14%. Let's humanize that number. Meet the time tax. In China, a truck drives from Shanghai to Beijing in 12 hours. In India, that same distance might take 3 days. Why? Because of potholes, state border checkpoints, bribes, and traffic jams that last for hours. Locals have a word for how they survive this. They call it jugaad. It translates roughly to a hack or a quick fix. It's duct taping the bumper back on because you can't afford a mechanic. Jugaad is a sign of Indian creativity. But in logistics, jugaad is a disaster. Apple doesn't want quick fixes. Apple wants just-in-time precision. You cannot run a global supply chain on jugaad. This 6% difference doesn't sound like much, but in the razor-thin margin world of manufacturing, 6% is your entire profit. If it costs 6% more to move the iPhone across India than across China, the iPhone stays in China. But there's a deeper reason the hardware isn't getting built. It's not just about money, it's about power. There is a concept in economics called the Shackled Leviathan, made famous by Acemoglu and James Robinson. It explains why some states can act and others are paralysed. China is a despotic leviathan. When the Communist Party wants to build a high-speed rail line, they draw a line on a map. If that line goes through a village, the village is gone. If it goes through a graveyard, the graveyard is moved. They pour the concrete. The train is running in 2 years. It is brutal, it is authoritarian, but it is effective. India is different. India is a shackled leviathan. It is a democracy, and in a democracy, the village can sue the government. Professor Devesh Kapur points out that the Indian state is often strong on paper, but weak on the ground. They can pass a law in New Delhi to build a massive factory zone, but the local magistrate in the district? He doesn't have the staff to enforce it. Or worse, he is paralysed by local politics. China is the dictator landlord who renovates your kitchen while you're sleeping. You wake up, it's done. India is the homeowners association, where every neighbour has to sign off before you can change a light bulb. Freedom is great for the soul, but it is terrible for building a highway. Former Central Banker Raghuram Rajan warns about this in his book, The Third Pillar. He argues that because local communities feel ignored, they fight back against every project. The result is that infrastructure projects in India take years to clear land acquisition hurdles. By the time the road is finally built, the factory investor has already moved to Vietnam. But the hardware is only half the story. The real tragedy lies in the software, the bureaucracy itself. To understand this, we have to talk about the villain of Indian economic history, the License Raj. For those who didn't live through it, from 1947 to 1990, India was a rigid socialist economy. It was illegal to produce more goods than the government allowed. If you wanted to expand your factory, you needed a license. If you wanted to fire a worker, you needed a license. If you wanted to import a computer, you waited 6 months. In 1991, India supposedly liberalised. They ran out of money, went to the IMF, and burned the rule book. But did they? Historians will tell you that while the laws changed in the capital, the culture didn't change in the basement. The ghost of the License Raj is still alive in the local government offices. We see it in what locals call the Babu culture, the bureaucrat who sits behind a desk surrounded by dusty files whose only power comes from saying no. This is why India suffers from a phenomenon known as the missing middle. In every healthy industrial economy in history, Germany, Japan, America, you have a massive layer of medium-sized factories employing millions of people. These are the engines of the middle class. In India, that middle is missing. Instead, you have a few giant conglomerates, the Tatars, the Reliances, and the Adanis, who are big enough to navigate the bureaucracy. And then you have millions of tiny, informal mum and pop shops that stay small on purpose. They stay small because if they grow, the inspector shows up. If they grow, the taxman comes. If they grow, the labour laws kick in. So they stay small, and because they stay small, they cannot buy modern machines, they cannot export, and most importantly, they cannot hire the millions of young people entering the workforce every year. And this brings us to the demographic dividend myth. Everyone says India is lucky because it is young. They say a young population is an economic weapon. But history teaches us that a young population is only a dividend if you have factories for them to work in. If you don't, it is not a dividend, it is a revolution waiting to happen. Let's look at the workforce audit, and specifically, let's look at the half of the population that history forgot. Now we arrive at the favourite argument of every optimist in the room, the people. They call it the demographic dividend. The logic is simple biology. China is getting old and shrinking. India is young and growing. By 2030, India will have the largest workforce in human history. On paper, this looks like an unstoppable economic weapon, but the reality is very different. Here's what the numbers actually show. 1 billion young people without jobs isn't a dividend, it's a time bomb. Let's look at the engine of this workforce. If you want to know why China grew so fast, you have to look at who was working. In China, the economic miracle was built by everyone, men and women. At its peak, nearly 70% of Chinese women were in the workforce, building the toys and phones that sit on your desk. Now look at India. The female labour force participation rate in India is shocking. It hovers between 24% and 32%. You're trying to win a race against the world's biggest superpower and you've left half your team on the bench. Professor Raghuram Rajan has flagged this repeatedly. He points out that while cultural norms are shifting, the safety and transport infrastructure, the hardware we just talked about, makes it incredibly difficult for women in rural areas to commute to factory jobs. So the workforce is smaller than it looks, but what about the quality? This brings us to the English myth. The standard argument is that India has a massive advantage because its people speak English. And yes, if you walk into a boardroom in Mumbai or a tech park in Bangalore, the English is impeccable. But if you zoom out to the average graduate from a Tier 3 college in a small town, the reality is painful. The India Skills Report found that less than half of Indian graduates are actually employable. They have the degree, but they don't have the skills. We have a situation where millions of young people are waiving college diplomas, but companies like Tata and Infosys have to spend months retraining them just to do basic tasks. It is a paradox. The country with the most people on Earth is suffering from a labour shortage. Companies can't find the people they need, and people can't find the jobs they want. And this leads us to the most dangerous trap of all, the service sector fantasy. There is a popular theory, you'll hear it from YouTube economists, that India can leapfrog the dirty phase of manufacturing. They say India doesn't need to build factories, it can skip straight to services, IT and tech. It sounds clean, it sounds modern, it sounds like Silicon Valley. But historically and mathematically, it is a lie. Let's run the numbers. The Indian IT sector, the crown jewel of the economy, employs about 5 million people. These are the high-paying, English-speaking jobs we hear about. 5 million people. India has a population of 1.4 billion. Even if you double the IT sector, even if you triple it, you are barely scratching the surface. What do the other 900 million people do? They can't all be coders. They can't all work in call centres. History is very clear on this. No major country has ever become rich without a massive industrial revolution. In the Industrial Revolution, the British peasant moved from the farm to the textile mill. The mill didn't require him to read Shakespeare, it just required him to stand there and work. That is how you lift poverty. You create low-skill jobs for low-skill people. India has created high-skill jobs for the elite and left the farmers to rot. This is what economists call the Lewis turning point. It's the moment when a country runs out of cheap farm labour and becomes an industrial power. China passed that point 10 years ago. India hasn't even started. By skipping the factory phase, India has trapped itself. It has created a VIP economy. It is great for the top 10% who live in gated communities and order from apps, but for the hundreds of millions of young men in the villages, there is no plan. There is a local slang word you hear in North India, time pass. It refers to groups of young men just hanging around, sitting on motorcycles, staring at their phones, doing nothing. Not because they are lazy, but because there is literally nothing for them to do. That is not a dividend. That is social unrest waiting to happen. So if the hardware is broken and the workforce is underutilized, is there any hope? Or is this just a tragedy? Well, there is a path out, but it requires doing the one thing that Indian politics hates to do. Let's go to the competition. So if the factories are leaving China, where are they actually going? The Indian media loves the term China plus one. It's the global strategy where companies keep one factory in China and open a second one somewhere else, just to be safe. The assumption in New Delhi is that the plus one is automatically India. But if you follow the money trail, it tells a very different story. The money isn't blindly walking into India, it is sprinting toward Vietnam, Mexico and Bangladesh. Let's look at Vietnam. Vietnam is a fraction of India's size. It has a fraction of the population. Yet in many years, Vietnam exports more manufactured goods than the entire subcontinent of India. How? While India was giving speeches about self-reliance, Vietnam was signing free trade agreements. Vietnam has slashed tariffs. They made it incredibly easy to import parts, assemble them, and ship them out. They understood the one golden rule of modern manufacturing. To sell to the world, you must buy from the world. India has gone the other way, under the guise of Atmanirbhar Bharat, which means self-reliant India. The government has actually raised tariffs on imports. They put up walls. The logic is patriotic. If we tax foreign goods, people will be forced to buy Indian goods. It sounds great at a political rally, but in the global supply chain, it is suicide. Let's take the iPhone again. An iPhone is made of hundreds of parts from dozens of countries. Glass from Korea, chips from Taiwan, sensors from Japan. If you tax every single part that enters India, the final phone becomes too expensive to sell globally. Raghuram Rajan calls this import substitution. It is a failed economic theory from the 1970s. It didn't work then, and it doesn't work now. By trying to protect its local industries, India is accidentally making them uncompetitive. You are essentially telling your athletes, you don't need to train against the best in the world. We will just ban the other runners so you can win the local race. That makes you feel good at home, but you get slaughtered at the Olympics. This protectionism is why Tesla hesitated for so long. It's why huge semiconductor projects struggle to get off the ground. Investors look at the tariff walls and say, why bother? I'll just go to Mexico. Mexico is right next to the American customer. Vietnam is right next to the Chinese supplier. India is in the middle, geographically blessed, but politically isolated by its own walls. And this leads us to the final piece of the puzzle, the most uncomfortable truth of all, the stability illusion. We assume India is stable because it is a democracy. We assume China is risky because it is a dictatorship. But for a factory owner, stability means knowing exactly what the rules will be in 5 years. In China, the rules are harsh, but they are predictable. In India, the rules can change overnight. In 2016, the government demonetized 86% of the country's cash overnight. Just like that, billions of dollars in cash were declared worthless. In 2020, they banned TikTok and dozens of Chinese apps overnight. In 2023, they suddenly restricted the import of laptops without a license, throwing IT companies into panic only to pause the rule a day later. This policy whiplash terrifies investors. You cannot build $1 billion chip plant if you are afraid the government might change the tax code or ban your supplier on a Tuesday morning just to win a headline. So when you add it all up, the broken hardware, the unskilled workforce, and the protectionist walls, the verdict becomes clear. India is not on the path to becoming the next China. It is on the path to becoming the next Brazil, a country of massive potential, massive hype, but one that gets stuck in the middle income trap forever. But is it too late? The window is closing, but it is not shut. There is a way out. Let's go to the verdict. So what's the final verdict? The verdict is that India is walking into a trap. Economists call it the middle income trap. It's what happens when a country gets rich enough to consume but not productive enough to compete. It's what happened to Brazil. It's what happened to South Africa. They had the potential, they had the people, but they got stuck. India is in danger of becoming the next Brazil, not the next China. The new king narrative we see on the news is dangerous because it breeds complacency. When you tell a student he is already a genius, he stops studying. When you tell a country it is already a superpower, it stops building. The stock market in Mumbai is hitting record highs. The billionaires are getting richer, but the real economy, the one where 1.4 billion people live, is gasping for air. You cannot build a superpower on a foundation of jugaad. You cannot employ 1 billion people with services, and you cannot win a global trade war with protectionism. If India wants to truly claim this century, it has to stop believing its own hype. It needs to do the boring, unsexy, painful work. It needs to build the roads, even if it means fighting the local protests. It needs to lower the tariffs, even if it hurts the local oligarchs. It needs to invest in primary schools for the poor, not just IITs for the elite. The window is closing. Automation is coming. AI is coming. The era of cheap labour is almost over. If India doesn't build its industrial base in the next 10 years, robots will take those jobs forever. China didn't become a superpower by waiting for destiny. They built it, concrete pour by concrete pour, factory by factory. India has the hunger, it has the energy, it has the democracy. But until the hardware catches up to the software, until the factory catches up to the phone, India will remain a paper tiger. The hype says buy, the audit says wait, and that is the reality of the Indian economy. But India isn't the only giant ignoring the history books. Across the ocean, America is making a similar mistake. I am currently working on a forensic audit of Trump's America. We are going to compare his policies against the actual 1900s blueprint that built the American superpower. I'm Mr. Moore, and this is The Economy Historian. If you made it this far, leave your comment below. That lets me know who the true students of history are. Subscribe to see the blueprints history tries to hide. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you soon.